Okay, sorry to keep you waiting. First of all, hello and welcome to this first of two webinars this afternoon on challenge funds, organized jointly by IPE Triple Line, Sida and the DCED. My name is Melina Heinrich Fernandez and I work for the DCED Secretariat. I see that many people are still in the process of joining or have not successfully connected their audio yet. But it's now 3:05, so I would suggest that we kick off anyway and hope that more people will be joining as I just say a few introductory words. Just briefly, for those of you who don't know much about the DCED is essentially a forum used by all major donor and development agencies who work with the private sector to exchange practical experience and lessons learned. And one of the 6 working groups in the DCED focuses on the theme of private sector engagement, and it currently works on issues such as enhancing the capacity of agency staff to engage with businesses and developing practical advice on how to do this most effectively. Interestingly, do you still hear me? Sorry for the glitch. While most donors do use challenge funds as an engagement modality, it is still much debated when or how they might work best. So for this webinar, we have joined forces with IPE Triple Line, who have recently completed a very informative evaluation of Sida's 10 global challenge funds, and so have a lot of fresh insights to offer on when it is actually best to use challenge funds rather than other modalities. And if you haven't read the evaluation, I warmly recommend that you do. It's really insightful. So now before we start, just a few practical points. This webinar will go for about an hour. Matthew Kentridge of IPE Triple Line will kick off with a presentation of about 20 minutes. And will then be joined by his colleagues Martin Wright and David Smith who will hopefully answer all of your questions during the discussion. And you may also hear from DCED coordinator Jim Canbran during that. So now you know everyone who will be speaking. Some of you have already submitted questions in advance, but if you do have any comments or questions, please use the chat box at the bottom right. And make sure to send the questions to everyone. The default here is to send to DCED only, but then the presenters wouldn't be able to see your questions. So please select send to everyone there. Unless the presenters ask you to explain a comment or question, please do keep your microphone muted and always keep your camera switched off. After the webinar, we would of course very much welcome your feedback. And so we will share a link to a very short feedback form. I promise it's really short in the chat box. So we would really appreciate your comments afterwards. Sida has also asked us to let you know that any follow-up questions on their challenge funds can be sent to them via email. So we'll also share a dedicated email address with you at the end. That is it for the housekeeping. Now let me hand over to Matthew Kentridge, who will tell us more about this very important question on when it is actually appropriate to use challenge funds. Matthew, over to you.
Melina, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. This is Matthew Kentridge from IPE Triple Line. Very pleased to be here, and I'm very encouraged. My colleagues are by the number and diversity of people who've signed up to participate. Shows that the topic of challenge funds is extremely important to people, and it's also very interesting to us to see the range of organizations that are participating. We have donor agencies and foundations. There are research institutes, universities, NGOs, multilaterals. There are individuals working in development, all of which are invested either as funders or managers, policy makers or development practitioners in the roles that challenge funds can play in development. So I think it's very good that we have the opportunity as a collective to discuss this topic. But to start at the beginning, there is no single definition out there of a challenge fund, but there's a general consensus that a challenge fund may be defined as a funding mechanism to allocate donor funds for a specific purpose or to address a specific development challenge using a transparent, competitive application process to select projects for fundings. And in this instance, grantees have a large degree of freedom when it comes to finding and designing innovative solutions to particular challenges, because the challenge fund itself tends to focus on desired outcomes but does not prescribe means to get there. And funds should also be seen as mechanisms that play a catalytic role, looking to achieve a multiplier effect from their own funding. And this can be done by sharing risk and funding requirements with grantees. In many funds, grantees are expected to put up the same amount of money that the fund themselves puts into their project. But also by leveraging other funds, and ultimately the objective is also to crowd in investment behind the fund from third-party sources. We can take challenge funds and further divide them into two broad types, which we talk about at some length in our evaluation. The first one we call Enterprise Challenge Funds, or ECFs. And these are funds that are allocated to private sector organizations to create economic outcomes that are commercially viable and sustainable. And so they may be as broad as creating new markets or higher incomes for certain groups of people. They may focus on job creation opportunities or bringing people who were previously marginalized or vulnerable into the mainstream economy and giving them mainstream economic opportunities. The second type that we talk about are civil society challenge funds, or CSFs, which are funds allocated to civil society organizations such as NGOs or nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations, which address social rather than economic challenges, and which aim for attitudinal and policy changes to deliver long-term benefits. And as you'll see in a moment, Sida has examples of both types of challenge fund in their portfolio. But where this evaluation came from is the fact that Sida has now been funding challenge funds for more than 10 years, and those 10 years have given the organization a steep learning curve. So in the course of it, they've learned, Sida has learned what the implications are if they act both as donor and fund manager. They have a better sense of what their fiduciary duties and responsibilities are, what governance arrangements work well for donor agencies, when they can sit on boards of funds and when they can't. They have a sense of how different types of procurement, whether it's a tender or whether it's an open call, affect the design of the fund and the relationship that the donor agency would have with fund managers. So all of this has led Sida to the point, or led them to the point at the start of this year of saying, let's take a step back and evaluate where we got to and what we think about challenge funds as a modality for development. Before we get into the detail of the discussion today, which is around under what conditions are challenge funds an appropriate instrument for development, I think it's worth spending a few minutes for just talking about the range and nature of Sida's portfolio of global challenge funds. So if we move to the second slide, please, you'll see a timeline which shows Sida's involvement with global challenge funds, starting in around about 2007 with the fund demo environment and running through to the most recently created funds, Sustainability and Resilience and Innovations Against Poverty 2, which started in 2016 with the Sustainability and Resilience Fund due to run from 2021, but potentially with rollovers for other funds as well. Now, what's interesting about the portfolio is how diverse it is. This is by no means a one-size-fits-all portfolio at all. There are funds in which all the money is put up by Sida, and those would be like the Innovations Against Poverty funds or Sustainability and Resilience. And then, but in the main, the funds are multi-donor funds in which Sida's contribution varies from relatively large to relatively small. We also see, as you can see from the coloring of the slide, a mix of enterprise challenge funds and civil society challenge funds, with the majority being ECFs. And the portfolio also includes large funds. The Global Innovation Fund, for example, has funding of approximately $200 million to disperse, and small funds such as Sustainability and Resilience, which has a total budget of approximately $6 million. The diversity also extends to the number of grantees who receive funding from these funds. Amplify Change has either provided for grant funds or committed grant funds to over 400 grantees, whereas other funds, such as Sustainability and Resilience, are providing 10 grants, or Global Innovation Fund, Amplify, and Innovation Poverty 2 are in the 30s. So there's a very wide difference in the number of grantees that might be funded and by implication, the amount of money that each grantee would receive. Similarly, we see diversity when it comes to geography. We have funds like the Global Innovation Fund or Innovations Against Poverty 1, which had a worldwide ambit. Whereas against that, we have other funds such as IPE 2, which functions only in 4 countries, or AECF, which tends to go deep rather than broad in its operations in Eastern and Southern Africa. Secondly, we have sector agnostic funds. In other words, they will consider applications from organizations operating in any sector. The Global Innovation Fund would be an example of that. Versus funds which are very, very sectorally focused. And a good example of that would be Amplify Change, which focuses on sexual and reproductive health rights for women and men in developing countries, or Powering Agriculture and Securing Water for Food, which focus on the link between agriculture and energy and water. And finally, diversity is also evident in different fund models employed, and we'll be talking about fund management and effectiveness of fund management later this afternoon when my colleague Martin Wright speaks at the second webinar. But it's worth noting that the portfolio includes examples of fund management models where the donor is also the fund manager. This was the case of time with Innovations Against Poverty 1, where Sida was both donor and fund manager. And we also see it with Powering Agriculture and Securing Water for Food, where USAID is both the lead donor and the fund manager. The majority of funds, however, are managed through external service providers, an individual organization or a consortium of organizations, where the fund manager is contracted by the lead donor to manage the process over the life of the fund. So an example would be Innovations Against Poverty 2, which is managed by SNV. And there is a third model, which we will also touch on, which is where the fund manager is an independent entity which manages funds for donors for a defined period, but which continues to raise money to establish rollover or new funding windows on a continuous basis. And the examples there would be AECF and the Global Innovation Fund, both of which are legal entities in their own right. If we move on to the third slide, please. Thanks, Jim. What we see is that since the launch of Demo Environment in 2007, Sida has spent or has committed a total of approximately 1.27 billion Swedish krona, and this is a figure that's likely to be much higher following new pledges from Sida to AECF, which is approximately at current exchange rates $140 million. This commitment, however, it's important to note, is about 20% of the value of these funds in total. And it points to one of the key motivations for using challenge funds in the first instance, and that is the ability to leverage the funding power of partner donors. So in this case, Sida can point to the fact that its investment has leveraged an additional 4.6 billion krona. That's about 360% of its own actual outlay. And other donors can make similar arguments about their own investments. So with this 10-year history behind it, the question of whether to continue investing in challenge funds looms large for Sida, as I said earlier. And Sida, on the back of that, Sida commissioned an evaluation of its 10 global funds, and it focused on 2 overarching questions. The first question is, to what extent have challenge funds proven to be appropriate mechanisms for achieving development outcomes? The second question is, to what extent has the fund management process supported successful achievement of program objectives? And today's session, the one right now, addresses the first question and focuses under what conditions challenge funds are relevant mechanisms, while the next session this afternoon, which Martin Wright will present, will look at ways to make challenge funds more efficient and effective. Now, the establishment of a challenge fund follows a decision-making process which starts with the overall donor strategy and objectives and moves through specific program objectives to the decision on what program mechanism to use. So if we can move to slide 4, you will see this laid out on the left-hand side. In the case of Sida, the first consideration was what were the principles for Swedish development cooperation. From there, we moved to specific program objectives and then decisions on the mechanism. And once a decision had been taken to set up a challenge fund, it moved to the design of the fund. Once that's taken, there are a series of decisions around how the fund itself will operate, but those decisions are going to be discussed in the second webinar today. But turning back to the initial set of decisions, in the case of Sida, the decision to use challenge funds as a development funding modality followed a new strategic direction in the mid-2000s, which focused on the private sector as a driver and partner in solving development challenges, and which also called for a greater focus on innovative partnerships and ways of working, and by extension, within Sida itself, a greater appetite for innovation and risk. So we see that there was a direct link between challenge funds as a mechanism and the overall strategic direction in which the organization was moving. And the new strategic focus was embodied in, firstly, Demo Environment, the Demo Environment Challenge Fund, and then in the Innovation Against Poverty Challenge Fund. And these were set up, obviously, for specific development to address specific development challenges, but also very much so to test challenge funds as a mechanism for achieving development outcomes. So they were seen as test beds, if you like, for the modality. And once we reach this point, we have to ask the question, it's fine if you set up a challenge fund as an experiment, but if you move beyond that, the specific program objectives. And, when would you use a challenge fund? When would you decide that a challenge fund is the appropriate modality, or when would you potentially move towards more traditional types of programming? So what the 10 years of Sida's experience in challenge fund, as well as the experience of many other challenge funds run by other agencies and foundations, has shown is that there are certain preconditions which need to be considered before deciding whether to establish a new challenge fund. And if we move to slide number 5, we will go through those. The first requirement for a challenge fund is that if successful, it is likely to lead to systemic change. Now, this is not an absolute imperative. There are times, as we shall see, when systemic change may not be the overarching ambition of a challenge fund, but for the most part, challenge funds are looking for system-wide impact. Systemic change, as the name implies, should pervade all parts of a system. It would look at the relationships between actors and interdependencies between different parts of a system, and it would look at the kinds of processes that are put in place. So in other words, it aims for an outcome that is greater than the sum of the parts, and that moves beyond the outcomes achieved by individual projects to look for ones that have a system-wide effect. Now, for enterprise challenge funds, what we're talking about are individual projects or project portfolios that will have a market-making impact, and that will also be able to provide good services and opportunities for people at the base of the pyramid. In other words, they are pro-poor activities that have a system-wide impact on people at the bottom of the pyramid. For civil society challenge funds, systemic impact means driving change through the weight of initiatives that are taken up, and this is in order to create long-term transformation in attitudes, policy, and opportunities. Now, the drive to systemic change can be direct. So, for example, the challenge fund can be aimed at creating a market. And an example of this would be the AECF REACT window, which catalyzed the market for renewable energy in East and Southern Africa. So it took a market that was nascent and grew it dramatically. Or it can be indirect. So if you take something like Innovations Against Poverty, the Innovations Against Challenge Funds, numbers 1 and 2, have set up their own project portfolios, but they are focused on testing inclusive business models for serving the poorest of the poor. So a systemic effect will be knock-on opportunities for people at the base of the pyramid as a result of these business models being successful. As I said earlier, not all challenge funds specify systemic change as a key requirement. And this may be because the challenge fund itself is experimental, as I just mentioned earlier. And this is important because the context makes transformation extremely difficult. And a case in point would be the AECF, that's the African Enterprise Challenge Fund's Sida-sponsored post-conflict window, which was set up in failed or fragile states in Africa. And here, the Challenge Fund was focused far more on providing basic goods and services to poor people, and also finding means to utilize resources that would otherwise be idle. If we look beyond systemic change to the supporting preconditions for setting up a Challenge Fund, the first of these is that the Challenge Fund should be additional. And this is defined by Sida as an intervention that triggers a pro-poor development impact that would not have without the intervention of the Challenge Fund. So the test in this case is not whether a Challenge Fund grantee could have theoretically received funding from another source, but whether they would have done so. As one AECF grantee reported, we might have started without the fund, but AECF funding has been essential to bridge the famous valley of death. In other words, it is possible that commercial funding was available in the market, but these are projects that were too high risk to receive that funding and required grant funding or bridge funding from a challenge fund in order to test and prove certain innovations before they would be able to secure funding from more traditional sources. It's also important to note that additionality is taken very seriously by challenge funds. So, for example, AECF considers both input additionality. They ask whether other funds are available or accessible to applicants during the application process. And they also look very closely at output additionality, and they ask whether the funding will generate additional benefits in the form of faster, greater, or more inclusive impacts that might otherwise be achieved, or reaching a wider population than would otherwise be the case. But of course, it is also worth noting, and I suspect this will come up in discussion, we picked this up in some of the questions that have already been put forward, that additionality is essentially two-sided. On the one hand, we ask whether commercial funding could have been available, but is withheld because the project is deemed too risky. On the other hand, we also ask whether the grant would displace or crowd out commercial funding, in which case the application should not pass the additionality test. The next precondition for using a challenge fund is that while the objective may be very clear and is often simply and clearly stated, there is no single proven solution available. So, for example, if you take Powering Agriculture objective to fund innovative and sustainable business models at the intersection of agriculture and clean energy in developing countries, that is a clear enough objective. But what are those business models? We don't know, and that is why we need a challenge fund in order to find out, essentially, in order to test different models and see which ones are effective. Similarly, Amplified Change seeks to secure universal recognition of sexual and reproductive health rights as human rights. But in the absence of a proven route to this outcome, has funded over 400 different grantees, as I've said, to find solutions that generate impact in different communities. And another example, which is not part of this portfolio, but is, I imagine, well known to people on this call, would be DFID's Girls Education Challenge, which is committed to increasing the number and duration of girls in formal education, and which likewise has spent, at this point, hundreds of millions of pounds on hundreds of different projects to find pathways that are replicable and scalable in different contexts. So, in short, challenge funds go beyond the usual suspects. They look for individuals or organizations with innovative ideas, but generally without the means to test or prove them. And the challenges they face tend to be universal, which means that we're unlikely to find a single silver bullet solution, but we'll need a range of options to cater for different political, economic, and cultural contexts. So faced with such challenges, it makes sense to cast the net wide, understanding that some ideas will fail while others will have the potential to succeed. Challenge funds, we also believe, are effective and appropriate mechanisms for development in contexts where capital markets are immature and there is a scarcity of commercial capital for development projects. Challenge funds are set up as risk-sharing mechanisms. So enterprise challenge funds share risks with private sector companies, and civil society challenge funds share risks with CSOs and ultimately with government as well. And the key function is to open up and de-risk hard-to-reach markets at the macro level. So, for example, as I said before, AECF's post-conflict window was operating in Somalia, South Sudan, Liberia, the DRC, and Sierra Leone, where traditional sources of commercial capital were missing, or at a micro level, where they provide bridging finance during the test and transition phase, which is the riskiest phase of the innovation pathway from ideation to scale. I'll give you an example of how this might work. The Global Innovation Fund provided a 2.5 million subordinated loan to an outfit called Babangona, an agricultural extension business in northern Nigeria. And once Babangona had proven its model, it was then able to secure an additional $25 million of commercial capital, which crowded in behind the original loan. Challenge funds are also effective in situations where business and civil society organization networks are present, but are constrained by weak supply-side conditions, for example, weak public institutions or a lack of infrastructure, immature supply chains and distribution networks. To take an example, when AECF was considering setting up their renewable energy REACT window, they conducted detailed analyses of the energy sectors in target countries to see which models would be most effective given supply-side conditions. And similarly, the windows that they set up in Zimbabwe and Tanzania were set up in in-depth analyses of supply-side constraints to see what would or what would not be possible for the fund in those conditions. But it's also worth noting that challenge funds have the potential to generate demand in developing countries. So Innovation Against Poverty's focus on inclusive business models aims to unlock latent demand for goods and services at the base of the pyramid, while Making All Voices Count aimed stimulated a nascent demand, giving people an experience and a taste for something they didn't know they lacked. And in this case, it was access to and involvement in political processes and decision-making at an individual level. Now, moving on, challenge funds need a mandate from government to operate, otherwise they may be perceived as a threat, and this will lead to different kinds of clampdown and obstacles to implementation and operation. Examples might be government regulations which prohibit funding to private companies and NGOs, which prohibit aid funding, I should say, to private companies and NGOs, or restrictive tax regimes which penalize new entrants in different sectors. So what one is looking for when deciding to set up a challenge fund or selecting markets in which to operate are conducive political environments which are characterized by absence of corruption, the presence of competition in the market, and which tend to have enabling rather than restrictive tax regimes. But having said that, of course, I think we all know that this is often not the case, and it's often difficult to find. And so it's important, therefore, for donors and fund managers to have a nuanced understanding of the political environment in which they will be operating, and to recognize the importance of activities such as lobbying and stakeholder engagement and the provision of different kinds of support services to win backing and acceptance from the governments of the territories in which they'll be operating. The last couple of points that I want to make, because I'm aware that I'm moving out of time, is that challenge funds are also extremely important, and this is fundamental to the idea behind challenge funds and the reason for having them. They're effective mechanisms in situations where there is scope to enter into private sector and civil society to find solutions to development challenges. So if we are in a position where for a particular challenge or a particular sector, there are only ever going to be 2 or 3 applicants who would sign up for the challenge fund because there are only a couple of organizations operating in it, then a challenge fund doesn't make sense as a modality, and a more traditional tender-based programming would most likely be more effective. But in situations where large numbers of organizations have ideas, have come up with innovative solutions and want to test them out, an example would be the 400 different projects that Amplify Change has sponsored to look at sexual and reproductive health then a challenge fund makes a lot of sense as a modality for testing out these ideas. Now, there's one final point I want to make, and then we will move to questions, and that is the following. Creating a challenge fund does not always follow a clear and rational decision-making process in which options are considered and a challenge fund is then deemed to be the best option. Often the decision is made for experimental or political reasons, such as testing a new approach or bringing in the private sector, cementing partnerships between agencies, or the decision has already been made for you. So in the case of Sida's 10 global challenge funds, 4 were set up by Sida, but the rest were all established by donor partners, with Sida only joining at or after the inception phase. And Sida's decision to join in these cases was not driven necessarily by a hard, cold look at whether a challenge fund was the best modality for the challenge at hand, but rather a consideration of whether the design of the challenge fund that they were being invited to join was likely to lead to successful outcomes. And what we learned from this example, from the situation where donors may join the challenge fund late or maybe junior partners in the challenge fund, is that there are certain things that must be in place to be successful. The first is that they should join at a point where they can still influence the fund design and the terms of reference of the fund manager. And they must also ensure that they share focus and objectives and a definition of success with other partners. And Sida has been extremely successful in this respect in terms with the challenge funds it joined late, because it has been extremely influential both in the design of funds. I'm thinking of the AECF in particular, where Sida has created a series of new windows which were not there in the original conception, but also in the way that they've brought cross-cutting issues such as the focus on poverty and the importance of gender mainstreaming into the DNAs of all the challenge funds in which they operate. And this has been an example of how an agency acts to direct and drive the focus and design of a challenge fund, even if they are not necessarily the establishing party. So I'd like to stop at that point, and I'm going to hand over to our moderators to moderate the questions, but we look forward to hearing from you. And I'm here, as I say, with my colleagues Martin and David, and we will be happy to discuss any of these points or take any of your questions. Okay, I see that we have a question, which is how critical is cooperation with local government for challenge funds to operate well? And this was built on the conducive political environment precondition that we mentioned. David, I don't know, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I would say it's critical to have local government. By local government, we national government or regional administrations. I would say it's critical to at least have the buy-in for the challenge fund to operate. I think there have been instances in some of the wider global challenge funds where the challenge fund mechanism didn't have a full license to operate. Okay, can you hear me? Is that better? Okay, so I think the answer to the question is yes. I mean, there have been cases in the past where challenge funds have not had a full license to operate in the country, and this has caused problems with the donor and problems with the fund manager in being able to continue with those projects. I know there were cases, for example, in the ACF, in both Ethiopia and in Tanzania, where this was called into question. So the short answer to the question is yes, it's really incumbent not just on the fund manager, but also on the donor to ensure that there is a license to operate for these funds, and there is a keenness for them to use this modality to operate.
Okay.
Maybe I could just add that in some funds it will be more important than others. For instance, if you had a civil society fund that was promoting a new approach to primary healthcare, and there was the intention that if successful, it could be adopted at a wider scale by the relevant government agencies, then it would be essential to involve those agencies from the outset. And similarly, for some of the enterprise challenge funds, there may be a need for some regulatory adjustments that would need to be implemented by government. So engaging with the government from the outset to identify those issues and address them in the longer term would be essential.
There's an important caveat to this, especially for enterprise challenge funds, is that what you don't want to have is a sense of government engagement with the projects themselves. It's very important that the challenge fund is seen to be a private sector solution, and therefore there should be no government actually involvement in the decision on the fund or on the project specifically, but there needs to at least be an overall government buy-in to the idea that private sector development and supporting businesses to achieve the Pro-Poor solution is a good thing.
Okay, there's another question that has come in from somebody working with the Challenge Fund in South Africa, who says, I work for a public sector challenge fund in South Africa with specific funding windows, each with a sector or industry focus. But the fund funds private sector, civil society, and even other public sector bodies. And it says, we judge on the merits of the project. So I'm just wondering, what is the meaning of categorizing ECF and CSCF? I mean, what is the practical use of such a distinction? David, do you want to comment, or?
I think the distinction really is important in the sense that if you're targeting the business community, you need to think very carefully about what fora you will use to advertise and promote the fund. And that will be very different than if you're targeting civil society organisations and using a different form of promotion. I would say that's a purely practical reason for making that distinction.
But I think there is a fundamental distinction between the two, and that is that with an enterprise challenge fund, you are, as I said at the outset, what you're doing is you're funding a project that you hope will be sustainable and commercially viable into the future. In other words, it will be self-sustaining because it generates its own income and profits. With a civil society challenge fund, of course, you have a similar objective, which is to be sustainable, but there is no expectation that it will be commercially viable. And in most cases with civil society challenge funds, the actual grantees and organizations involved are not-for-profit organizations or civil society organizations whose sustainability will have to come from a range of other sources. Whereas I see that this particular individual has a fund which covers both types of organization. I wouldn't say that is a common situation at all. I'd say that there are most enterprise challenge funds are focused on private sector organizations, which are commercial organizations, and they tend to be the grantees, and society challenge funds, the alternative. So I think your situation is unusual in this in this instance.
I mean, there are other very practical considerations in the sense that civil society organizations are often very used to understanding the processes of results measurement, of collecting data on the end beneficiaries. Enterprises are in the business of running a business and not necessarily having a connection with the end beneficiary, in other words, the poor people that the fund is contributing towards. So you have to have very different modalities for supporting the evaluation and monitoring of the data that you collect from the businesses and the end beneficiaries. Civil society organizations are generally better equipped to do this than businesses, so you have to adapt your results measurement processes when working with enterprises.
Let's take a look at some of the other questions. We have a question which says, what strategies have been successful to get beyond the usual suspects in development, like NGOs or development consultancies participating in challenges?
this is all about outreach. I mean, I think what we have found is that the best challenge funds are those that have scoped the opportunities for that challenge, have understood that there are potential businesses or civil society organizations that can meet that challenge, and have then used appropriate mechanisms to develop outreach. You know, a sign of a good challenge fund is that you've got at least 10 applicants for each grant. And so that is all about targeted marketing, and it's all about scoping the opportunity and the challenge before you launch it.
There's just one other comment on this as well. You know, there are some interesting initiatives that have been set up precisely with this in mind. So, for example, USAID has set up a Global Innovation Exchange database, and there are other organizations as well, like Results for Development, which have set up databases of applicants for challenge funds. So if you think about it, the vast majority of applicants for challenge funds are unsuccessful. So, for example, Global Innovation Fund received 3,000 applications and made 35 grants. So that is thousands of people who put in applications, who are working in certain areas, but who are unsuccessful. These databases now try to capture information on all the applicants of different challenge funds. So you now have a database of thousands, which can then be cut by area of interest, area of focus, sector where they work, innovation that they focus on. And if challenge funds come up where which touch on different topics or different objectives, it's possible to use databases like this to market the challenge funds to this extremely wide array of organizations, going beyond, as you say, just the usual suspects of NGOs and development organizations. Good. We have another question which asks, how long? So for what period post-grant should we be collecting results from challenge grants? And I'll give a quick answer to that, but I'm sure my colleagues will step in. One of the criticisms of challenge funds is that they're too short-term. In other words, grants tends to be for a period of 18 months to 3 years. The grantee receives the funding, it comes to an end, the challenge fund moves on, there's no actual monitoring or tracking of what's happened, whether the project that was funded has been sustainable or not. And we certainly made a finding and recommendation in our evaluation that there ought to be greater tracking of the outcomes and results of grant finance and of the activities of grantees. Now, AECF is a good example of a fund which tends to do this. So they have a contracting period with their grantees of 6 years, which is well beyond the length of time that the individual grantee is actually receiving the grant. But over the course of those 6 years, the grantee is required contractually to report back to AECF on progress. So that gives that fund and the opportunity to actually see what's happened and how successful different businesses have been that have received their funds. But that's quite unusual. And we certainly recommend that it ought to become more usual and ought to become something that all challenge funds do.
Yeah, there's a question here about the extent to which challenge funds create market distortion. I think that's an interesting question. I think the short answer to that is it's all about the assessment of additionality that should be done prior to the project being funded. So bear in mind that what we were saying earlier, that you're looking for a competitive fund for a large number of applicants for each grant that's funded, but you also need to do a very careful ex-ante test of whether that grant is actually doing something that the business in particular would not be doing otherwise. I think in most cases, and in most of the funds that we looked at, there was very little evidence of distortion. In fact, we didn't find any. I think there is quite a lot of evidence that many grant-funded projects can crowd in other funders, and there are many cases where grantees have received multiple funding. But that is not really evidence of distortion. It's just evidence of disseminating a good idea and extending it to enable additional sources of funds to come in. I think the short answer is right throughout sub-Saharan Africa, there is a shortage of risk capital. And I think a challenge fund, the instruments that we've seen, is a small contribution to addressing that. Okay, we've got another question about situations a challenge fund will definitely not work. Do you have examples on this? Okay, well, I think the reason we set out those key preconditions for using a challenge fund was an appropriate case in point. So when will a challenge fund not work? I think the most obvious answer is when you don't have enough potential applicants, whether that's civil society or businesses. So you might have a great idea, but you might be working in an environment where there are no businesses that would be able to respond to that challenge, or where you've set conditions of entry which are impossible for the applicant to meet. Do we have examples of that?
Well, I can think of an example of a program not included in this evaluation, where the challenges related to the development of inclusive agribusiness approaches, but the market was mature in that particular country, so there just weren't the number of businesses with the ideas to bring to the challenge. And in that case, you could make the case that a more proactive, making markets work for the poor approach might be more appropriate.
Yeah, and I think you can also, there are also examples, making all voices count would be one, where you go in with a set of assumptions and presuppositions about what is going to work for the challenge fund, and then discover in the course of it that in fact some of these assumptions are wrong and make it extremely difficult for the fund to succeed. So making all voices count was started in the early 2010s, following democratic movements in North Africa and the Middle East, and an assumption that governments were moving towards more open and more grassroots democracy in their approaches. And making all voices count is a grassroots democracy fund. But in the event, as the fund discovered, this move towards open government was really not, it didn't continue. There was a lot of shutdown that followed after this and made it extremely difficult for the fund to operate. And by the, it was a short-lived fund, and I would say that it only had small pockets of success in a few areas where the government was receptive, but not successful in other areas where government was not successful, or was not receptive to what it was trying to do.
I mean, understanding the local market is pretty fundamental. But there's a good case in the ACF, for example, where they failed to obtain any significant applications from Francophone West Africa. It wasn't sufficient to translate the forms and the application process into French. You actually had to go and meet the potential networks in Francophone West Africa in order to explain what the Challenge Fund was trying to achieve, and in order to get potential applicants to apply. So you don't necessarily assume that just because you've got a good idea and you're offering grant funds that you will get applicants. You have to research the market, you have to research whether there is going to be potential uptake for the opportunity that you're posing.
Okay, there's another question here asking us to elaborate on the outcomes and impact of the funds. It's referring to a figure in the report, which actually comes up in the second webinar, which notes progress in terms of being on track rather than expressing the actual outcomes and impact achieved. I think this is simply because, as an earlier slide indicated, though some of the funds have been running for some time, others are quite new, and they're still working towards the achievement of their outcomes and impact. And so that's simply why that measure was used to compare. But we might deal with that in more detail in the second webinar.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthew and David in particular, for these very insightful comments. And thank you everyone for your active questions as well. We have almost come to the end of this hour. So unless there are any burning remarks from Triple Line side, we would like to suggest closing this webinar now. I will just post now a link to the feedback form as announced in the chat box, so you'll be able to see that now. We would very much welcome very short feedback from your side. And also just to announce that, of course, we will now in a half an hour start the second webinar in the series on how to manage challenge funds effectively, where Martin Wright again will share the insights from this evaluation. Very interesting findings. Many of you know there is often a trade-off between a light touch approach to challenge funds or a very hands-on approach to managing partners, and we will find out more on what works best in managing challenge funds later on. So with this, I would like to close this webinar. Thank you again, everyone, and hope to see many of you in about half an hour. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.